Okay, this is our tutorial on inquiry-based teaching practices, and later on this week you'll be viewing another tutorial on the flipped classroom. So by now this quote is probably pretty familiar to you, as we've talked about it before, but I think more so than any week when we talk about inquiry-based teaching, that's really at the heart of what this quote is about. And inquiry-based teaching really is about trying to come up with ways to engage your students and really try to appeal to their natural curiosities to get them to work harder, think deeper, and retain information. At its heart, inquiry-based teaching really is about questioning, and it's about creating not just good questions, but great questions. Questions that not only align to the content that you want to teach through a particular unit or lesson, but questions that build a bridge between your content and the daily lives and interests of your students. So as we said from our opening quote, the whole point of inquiry-based teaching is to try to appeal to a student's natural curiosity. And we're going to use this as another motivational tool. In this class we've talked a lot about different teaching strategies in an effort to motivate students, and here's another one. So we're going to do a short opening exercise, just a kind of think to yourself kind of exercise. I want you to think back to a time where you've been involved in some kind of hobby project. If you're an artistic person, maybe you're painting something, painting a room in your house. If you're a mechanical person, you're working on something mechanical, or whatever it is that you're into. Think back to when you were working on a project and you just lost all sense of time. I mean, you just kind of, you started doing it. It's like 9 o'clock in the morning. You get into it, all of a sudden you look up and it's noon and you can't figure out where the time went. Think about that experience and think about why that was such a rewarding project. So that project example is really a good example of the state of mind that we're going to try to get students into with inquiry-based strategies. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, a very famous researcher, psychologist, studied this state of mind, and in the early 1990s actually gave it a name, and he called it flow. This is the state of mind that we get into when we are so into a project that we lose sense of time. We become highly focused. We also almost come slightly disconnected from the rest of the world, kind of in a zone in our own world. A lot of clarity, and like we said, time just ceases to have any meaning. And this is really our end goal. Our end goal from using inquiry-based strategies is to try to get our students into this cognitive state of flow, because we know if they're in this state, they're highly motivated and they're highly productive, and that's our goal. Daniel Pink has written several books that I think have been helpful for teachers. One of them is Drive, which really is about motivation. And he talks about the evolution of motivation, that what motivated us thousands of years ago doesn't motivate us anymore. And he actually talks about the history of motivation, or the evolution of motivation, in three basic phases. He says, in the beginning, motivation was about survival. We did what we needed to do. We hunted, we gathered, because if we didn't, we would die of starvation. And then he said things started to change as you get into the Industrial Revolution, as we leave farming and go into manufacturing. Things change, and we're motivated more by carrots and sticks. We're motivated by the fact that if we work harder, we're rewarded, and if we don't, we're punished. Pink says that this motivational phase, or the motivational strategy of carrots and sticks, was quite effective, but had limitations in the sense that it only motivated human beings when they were involved in processes that were very kind of set, algorithmic kinds of things, where the outcome was predetermined. And he said it's relatively recently that he's seen motivation evolve yet again, and that carrots and sticks are no longer effective for motivating students. Well, not just students, but anybody, as Pink isn't really necessarily a writer who focuses on education. There's a lot of corporate work as well. But he talks about the fact that getting people into that mental state of flow is particularly effective for motivating people when you want them to get engaged in very creative, critical thinking types of tasks. In a couple weeks, you have a reading assignment from Creating Innovators, which basically is a series of case studies of people that have been very successful innovators in the area of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And one of the things that this book does is it interviews each person and tries to kind of track back through their educational experience and try to find out what was unique in their educational experience that made them such a successful innovator. And three things jump out. One is that they were involved with things, or teachers allowed them to be involved with things that really connected to a personal passion that they had. Second thing was that teachers got them involved in things that had a higher purpose. And that's kind of what we're getting at with the inquiry-based strategy here. And last but not least, you'll see when you read the book, it talks about the concept of play, and that these innovators had experiences early on in their educational careers where they were involved in learning projects that were fun. So let's focus in on that purpose piece. And we talked about passion, purpose, and play. Let's focus on purpose, since I think that really is the heart of the inquiry-based strategy, and just how powerful purpose can be from a motivational standpoint. Now, most of us have read Tom Sawyer, and I want you to think back to that whitewash scene, all right, where Tom's getting punished by his aunt, who tells him that he has to spend his Saturday afternoon whitewashing the fence. And instead of whitewashing the fence, Tom is somehow able to recruit local kids to do the work for him while he sits by, eats an apple, and watches. So how did Tom do this? Well, he did this by creating, in this case, a false sense of purpose. He convinced the kids in the neighborhood that painting the fence was the most important, significant act in the world. And by doing so, they became highly motivated to paint the fence for Tom. And I know I'm oversimplifying things, but in a sense, when we use inquiry-based strategies, that's kind of what we're trying to do. We are starting with a question that connects to our content, a question that engages students. But in a sense, it is a trick, because our goal really is to teach students about very basic content from our curriculum, but we're going to use very engaging questions to build this sense of purpose, much in the way Tom did with his friends in the fence. Now, this motivational strategy is by no means unique to education. In the private sector and industry, you actually hear managers refer to it as the Tom Sawyer effect, when managers are able to give a higher sense of purpose behind tasks to really motivate workers. So if our goal is to use these inquiry-based strategies to get students into this cognitive state of flow where they're highly motivated, highly productive, and really sharp thinkers, let's talk about Pink's work again, go back to Drive, and talk about some of the factors that he's identified that really are essential in order to get students in a state of flow. The first thing is a high degree of autonomy in the tasks that they are completing. You really have to create student tasks or learning procedures that have a high degree of choice and options for students. If it's any kind of lockstep cookie cutter thing, they will not get into the state of flow. They have to have a degree of autonomy and have to be able to make decisions. The second thing, and I think is maybe the trickiest, is the task needs to be challenging, extremely challenging, but not impossible. And sometimes that's a very, very difficult line to walk, and it comes with experience, and it comes with doing some of these inquiry-based projects and activities several times to get it right. But it's a critical factor for getting them into this mental state. And last but not least, as we've been saying, the task has to have a higher purpose behind it. It can't just be, I'm doing this because the teacher wants me to, or I'm doing this because if I don't, I'll get an F. There has to be some kind of higher purpose behind it. That purpose may connect to something the student's interested in. It might be one of those save the world purposes, but purpose is key. So let's walk through some examples. I'll start out with a humanities-based example. It was really my first experience with inquiry-based teaching years ago, and one that worked out very well for me. Resulted in a New Jersey Department of Education Best Practice Award for me somewhere around 2001. And it really was the beginning of me seeing the potential of inquiry-based teaching. So at that time, I was teaching social studies and was looking to teach a basic Cold War unit. But by the time we got to the late 1990s, students were becoming disconnected with the Cold War. They didn't grow up in the Cold War. They didn't really have a sense or a memory of the paranoia and the fear of World War III. And the Cold War just started to become a series of disconnected events and facts. So I decided to build a Cold War unit around a question that I thought was definitely connected to Cold War content, but also highly engaging to my students. And that question was, who shot John F. Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963? Now, through the exploration of this question, I would build the project in such a way that students would be forced to explore all the topics that were in my Cold War unit in my curriculum: the Cuban Missile Crisis, the war in Vietnam, the Berlin crisis, the relationship between Khrushchev and Kennedy, the Bay of Pigs. All that content from my curriculum would be explored, but it would be explored through the context of students trying to solve a murder investigation. So these topics went from being just kind of inert topics to motives for a murder, motives for one of the highest profile murders in the history of the United States. And the final product for this inquiry-based project would be students would reenact a role play of the trial of Lee Harvey Oswald. Obviously, the trial that never happened probably would have been the trial of the century. But as we know, Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin of the president, is murdered shortly after the assassination by Jack Ruby. So when we talked about Daniel Pink's 3 factors that need to be present for state of flow, we talked about a degree of autonomy, and I want to show you an example here with this project. So I started off the project telling students that in the beginning it was just kind of a mock exercise, but I asked them if they could interview anybody, who would it be and why? I wanted them to really research actual historical figures that were part of the investigation and part of the Cold War, and tell me who they were and why they think that person would be such a great witness. And I figured that was it. But it got interesting when the students came up with the gentleman on the left here, retired FBI agent James Hosty. Hosty was the FBI agent that was actually assigned to conduct surveillance on Lee Harvey Oswald about a month and a half before the assassination. Now, an interesting thing about Hosty, and the students found this in their research, is that a week before the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald walks into the Dallas FBI office and demands to see Agent Hosty. Hosty's not there. Oswald scribbles a note down on a piece of paper for the FBI receptionist, asks the receptionist to make sure the note gets to Hosty, and obviously a week later, Oswald becomes the alleged assassin. Now that letter becomes the source of a lot of controversy, because after the murder, when it's discovered that Oswald did come into the FBI office before the assassination and did ask for Hosty and did write him a letter, obviously everybody wants the letter and wants to know what's on the letter, and it's at that time that Hosty reveals the letter has been destroyed. So Hosty becomes a very critical character in the midst of the various conspiracy theories, particularly conspiracy theories that revolve around the federal government, because obviously Hosty could be a link between the alleged assassin, Oswald, and the federal government. So the kids said to me, that's who we would bring, and I said, boy, that's great research, great job. They said, no, we would like to talk to him. So I said, well, all right, I'll give it a try. If you can find his address or his phone number or whatever, I'll try reaching out to him. They did. I reached out to him. and it was an amazing 45-minute conversation as Hosty took me through what it was like to conduct surveillance on Oswald prior to the assassination. He was the first to interrogate Oswald on November 22nd, and he walked me through the interrogation, the questions he asked Oswald, Oswald's demeanor, etc. And when it was all over, I thanked him, but he insisted on speaking to my students, and my students had the opportunity to interview him. So that interview was a tremendous opportunity for the students. We used just a little conference call phone, and they all huddled around the phone and got to interview James Hosty. Well, they weren't done there. Again, we talked about the importance of autonomy. They had the ability to choose more witnesses, and now I was kind of emboldened that I could get these people to actually talk to my kids. So the next person is our middle witness, Dr. Paul Peters, who was one of the surgeons that worked on Kennedy that morning. He's actually the surgeon that pronounced Kennedy dead. So we were able to, through a partnership with the FBI and the Central Intelligence Agency, they helped link me up with Dr. Paul Peters. And we had a phone conference interview with Peters, who walked the students through Kennedy's wounds, his own interpretations of direction of fire and things like that, as well as just what it's like to be a physician working and trying to save the life of the President of the United States. And the last witness they picked was eyewitness James Tague. James Tague was actually in Dealey Plaza that day and was actually hit in the cheek by the first shot. There were 3 shots fired at the president, and the first one missed the president's car, hit the ground, ricocheted, and hit James Tague in the cheek. So James Tague gave our students his own interpretation, eyewitness accounts of what happened that day, things he heard, things he saw, and his perspectives on where shots were coming from. So, like with all inquiry-based activities, it's more than just engaging activities. There is content here. So let's take a look a little deeper at this Who Shot JFK example and take a look at what we call the KUD, knowledge, understanding, and do. The knowledge is basically the content and skills from your curriculum. And if you look at this one example, this one KUD strand, one of the things I was trying to teach the kids was about the Vietnam War and how it was a critical piece to the Cold War, an asymmetrical conflict between 2 superpowers. But more than just memorizing those dates and names and battles and things like that, I was shooting for students to have an enduring understanding. And the enduring understanding I was shooting for in this particular thing is I wanted them to understand that post-colonial struggles for independence, like the Civil War going in Vietnam, were the brush fires of the Cold War. That's where the 2 superpowers ran into each other. And last but not least, in this particular project, what I would have them do, that's the D, to show me that they had this understanding, is as part of that final product, that role play of the trial, students would have to build an argument as to why Kennedy was either for or escalating our role in Southeast Asia. This is actually a critical piece of some of the conspiracy theories. So now let's leave the world of humanities and let's take a look at a STEM example. Cellular respiration and the Krebs cycle in particular. Some of you may remember the Krebs cycle from high school biology. I just dread it. I remember what it was like having to memorize all those molecules and be able to draw this diagram. So let's talk first about the traditional approach to teaching cellular respiration in the Krebs cycle, and then we'll look at it in an inquiry-based model. So the way I learned the Krebs cycle, the traditional approach, was that first we had a unit on photosynthesis, and we learned how plant cells make energy from sunlight. And then it was explained to us that animal cells are different. They make energy from glucose. And through processes like glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, that's how the body turns glucose into energy, or ATP. So this is the way that cellular respiration, the Krebs cycle, was taught to me. Now let's take a look at a totally different way to teach it. Starting off with a very interesting question. When we lose weight, where does it go? Now, this question could start out in a lot of different ways. It could start out with an emotional hook, maybe a clip from the show The Biggest Loser, but getting students to create some theories in groups as to when we lose weight, where does it go? And they'll come up with some very interesting theories. Some of them will say it goes down the toilet, and that's when you'll say, well, we're not talking about water weight. That's a different kind of thing. We're actually talking about fat, losing weight from fat. Some of them will have all kinds of theories that fat actually burns up in the body and gets absorbed. But after they come up with their own theories, they then will come up with ideas or questions that need to be answered to prove or disprove these theories. And that's when we'll provide resources on things like carbohydrates, glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, ATP, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll let students come up with some ideas on their own, but we will have an opportunity through resources as well as the teacher's own expertise to redirect them and get them on track and explain things in the correct manner. But we'll guide them to discovering the right answer to this interesting question on their own. And obviously the answer is we lose weight in the form of carbon dioxide. As we breathe, it comes out of your nose and your mouth. This inquiry-based idea could also be preceded by a homework assignment where students are asked to weigh themselves at night before they go to bed, and then in the morning when they wake up and see that they've lost weight. It might be a good way to get them started on this particular question. All right, so let's take a minute now to really dissect the structure, the anatomy of a good inquiry-based lesson, and we'll look at several examples. So first, a quick look at the structure of an inquiry-based lesson, something that Marshall in your Succeeding with Inquiry in Math and Science book refers to as the 4 E's: engage, explore, explain, and extend. So real quickly, when you take a look at these phases, I think the nature of the phase is kind of obvious by the title. Starting out with engage, obviously the goal is to hook the students around the question that you've designed. Remember, we said this question has to be aligned to both the student interests as well as the content you want to teach. And after they're hooked in the question, then they're provided with an opportunity to explore the question on their own first. Take a look at it, brainstorm on theories, develop hypotheses, try to figure out what kinds of additional sub-questions or even experiments or data collections need to be done to prove or disprove their theories. Then you get into explain, where it's the teacher's opportunity to redirect, clarify, provide additional resources, and make sure that all the energy that was expended in the explore phase is pointed in the right direction. And finally, in the extend phase, students are provided with an opportunity to apply everything they've learned to some sort of authentic task. So what's unique about this structure? Well, 2 things. I think the first one that's kind of obvious, must jump out at you, is the fact that explaining is done where it is. I think normally when we think of traditional teaching, teachers tend to explain things up front as opposed to give students an opportunity to explore them on their own first. I think the second thing, unfortunately, is that sometimes in a lot of the classrooms we see this engage phase doesn't even happen. And students really aren't given an opportunity to fall in love with the topic first, and the teacher kind of dives in and starts providing students with the answers. So I think those are the things that make this structure unique. Our first example is from a sample business unit that I worked on with a team of teachers years ago, where students were posed with not so much a question, more of a challenge, where they had to create a new division of a larger apparel company, and this new division was going to create sunglasses. And all of the marketing, finance, R&D, human resources challenges that would go into forming a new division of a corporation were involved in this inquiry-based project. So in the engage phase of this inquiry-based project, we actually called in this gentleman here, you see here on your right. He was at the time the CEO of a company called City Street, which was a subsidiary of Citibank. And we asked him to basically pitch the challenge of creating a new division with a new product line, much in the way he would do so at work. So we got the kids in the auditorium, and he posed the kids with the challenge. It was an extremely engaging, inspiring presentation, again, similar to the way that he hooked employees of City Street on the job. So in the explore phase of this project, students broke into their various groups: human resources, finance, R&D, and it took some time to really explore all the challenges of starting a new division. For example, students in the R&D group learned how to use CAD and CAM software to design sunglasses, and also learned about 3D printing and how to print out prototypes. I worked on the HR group, where we learned about hiring practices, recruiting, fair labor laws, employee benefit programs, all the kinds of things we would need to explore if we were really going to open up a new division and hire people. Once we started the explain phase of the project, now it was time to kind of take advantage of all that energy that students expended in the explore phase and just kind of redirect them and clarify and make sure they're in the right direction. For this project, we brought in outside experts from the field. Most of them were at the executive level, whether it be in human resources, marketing, etc. And the students basically shared what they found and shared their ideas within their particular subgroup: human resources, finance, etc. Shared these ideas with the outside experts, where the outside experts, along with the teacher, kind of as a team, got to clarify, correct, redirect. And in some ways, that was, I think, some of the best parts of this project, where students got to learn things from books and from websites, but when they actually got the opportunity to talk to industry people who do these jobs on a day-to-day basis, they got a very, very different picture. Finally, in the extend phase, we tried to set up a rather authentic scenario. You'll see in the picture here, this is actually at one of MetLife's conference rooms in Jersey City. And you'll see our students there to the left presenting their part of the business plan to a mock board of directors. You'll see me sitting all the way to the right with a lot less gray hair than I have now. And those other gentlemen were executives from MetLife and City Street who served on this mock board of directors, where they're basically listening to the business plan and all facets of the business plan that the students created, and giving them feedback, and at the end explaining to them, if this were in the real world, whether or not they would feel comfortable moving forward. It was a phenomenal experience for the students. At times, again, I think the conversation was surprising to students. I think sometimes students are used to working with their teachers who are much more, let's say, nurturing than people in the corporate world. So I think it was great to see the students get some real frank, honest feedback. So now I would like you to take a minute to review a second example. This one is from one of your textbooks, Succeeding with Inquiry, Marshall, and it's on page 51. And the lesson is called The Black Box. I think it's a great example of an inquiry-based lesson. This particular one would be in an introductory chemistry course. So as you go through the lesson plan, I want you to think about these 4 questions and think about each phase and try to identify what the teacher does in each phase to accomplish what you need to accomplish in the engage phase: explore, explained, and extend. And then also think big picture. The whole point of this, in addition to engaging students, is really, encouraging students to think. So I want you also to think about the question of how does this lesson really force students to think critically? All right, finally, you're going to be responding to a post titled Inquiry-Based Idea. And in this post, you're going to not write a lesson plan, but give us a broad idea for an inquiry-based lesson. As you know, in a couple weeks, you have an inquiry-based lesson due. And I just want you to have the opportunity to flush out an idea and for me to give you feedback on the idea. So either start with the unit that you've created for this class or a different unit. And start with an essential question. Start with a question that you think you can build an inquiry-based lesson around. Remember, that question has to both be engaging to students and aligned to your content. Critical. And then in the in the post, and I'll kind of put this in the prompt in the post, I just want you to write a sentence or two for each of the inquiry-based phases: engage, explore, explain, and extend, and tell us what you would do in this inquiry-based lesson plan. In addition to sharing your ideas, I would like you also to comment at least two of your classmates' ideas.